There was a time when emergencies did not mean calling strangers or waiting for systems to respond. They meant knocking on the neighbor's door, gathering on the porch, and figuring it out together. When someone in our neighborhood faced trouble, the response was immediate, personal, and rooted in the understanding that today's crisis could be tomorrow's own. We did not have safety nets made of paperwork and phone numbers. We had each other, and that had to be enough. When someone passed away, the house filled before the family even had time to think. Food appeared on the kitchen counter, brought by neighbors who understood that grief made it hard to cook. Casseroles, pots of greens, fried chicken wrapped in foil, cornbread still warm from the oven. No one asked what was needed. They simply brought what they knew would help. The women organized themselves without discussion, taking turns sitting with the grieving family, answering the door, accepting condolences, making sure no one had to face those first terrible hours alone. The men handled the practical things, the arrangements that needed making, the relatives who needed picking up from the bus station, the yard that needed tending so the house looked cared for when people came to pay respects. Money was collected quietly, passed from hand to hand in envelopes that were never opened in public. Funeral expenses were high, and most families did not have insurance that covered everything. The collection was not announced or formalized. Someone just started it, and everyone contributed what they could. $5 here, $10 there, sometimes just coins wrapped in tissue paper. No one kept track of who gave what. The point was not the amount, it was the participation, the acknowledgement that this loss belonged to all of us, and the cost of honoring the dead would be shared. Children were shuffled between households during these times, taken in by neighbors so the grieving family could handle what needed handling. No one called it babysitting. It was just understood that the kids needed to be fed, kept occupied, and shielded from some of the weight their parents were carrying. They ate dinner at Miss Helen's house, slept on pallets at Uncle James's place, and were returned home clean, fed, and quieted down. The community absorbed them the way water absorbs into soil, naturally and without resistance. When someone lost their job, the neighborhood responded with silent efficiency. Extra groceries appeared on the porch with no note attached. A bag of rice, canned goods, a whole chicken. The family knew where it came from, even if no name was spoken. Pride was protected by this anonymity. People could accept help without the sting of charity, because the help arrived as if delivered by the wind itself, inevitable and impersonal. The men who still had work would mention opportunities, a cousin hiring at the plant, a friend who needed help with construction, anything that might lead to a paycheck. Information moved through the neighborhood like electricity through wires, invisible but powerful. Rent money was the most urgent crisis, the one that could put a family on the street if not handled quickly. When word spread that someone was short, the solution was often a basement party. Not a celebration, but a fundraiser disguised as one. Music, food sold by the plate, a small entry fee that went straight to keeping the family housed. People came knowing exactly what they were supporting, and they danced with the same energy they would have brought to any party. The landlord got paid, the family stayed put, and the neighborhood proved once again that survival was a group effort. Medical emergencies brought their own kind of mobilization. Hospitals were far expensive and often unwelcoming. When someone got sick or injured, the response began at home. Somebody's grandmother knew remedies, poultices, teas brewed from roots and herbs passed down through generations. If the situation was serious enough to need a doctor, someone with a car would drive. Gas money was pooled, and the family was not left to navigate waiting rooms and paperwork alone. A neighbor sat with them, helped translate medical language into something understandable, and made sure they got home safely. Fires were one of the worst things that could happen. When a house burned, everything was lost in minutes. The family would be standing on the sidewalk in their nightclothes, watching smoke pour from windows, too stunned to even cry yet. Before the flames were out, neighbors were already opening their doors. Come stay with us until you figure things out. Clothing was gathered from closets, furniture pulled from storage, and within days the displaced family had the basics again. Not much, but enough to start over. No lease was signed, no end date discussed. They stayed as long as they needed, and when they finally moved into a new place, it was often furnished entirely with things donated one piece at a time from houses up and down the block. Winter brought its own emergencies. Heating oil was expensive, and some families simply could not afford to keep the furnace running all season. When temperatures dropped, neighbors paid attention to which houses had smoke coming from the chimney and which did not. Firewood appeared in yards. Extra blankets were delivered with some excuse about cleaning out closets. Families with heat invited those without to spend the coldest nights on their floors. Children sleeping in rows like they were at a slumber party. Parents trying to hide the humiliation behind gratitude. No one talked about it directly. The help was given and received with faces turned slightly away, preserving dignity even in desperation. Children who lost parents were absorbed into the extended family structure without hesitation. Aunts became mothers, grandmothers stepped in fully, and sometimes neighbors who were not blood took in kids simply because there was no other option that made sense. These were not formal adoptions with legal paperwork. They were decisions made at kitchen tables over coffee, handshakes that carried the weight of lifetime commitments. The child's life continued in the same neighborhood, the same school, surrounded by people who had known them since birth. They were not sent away to strangers. They stayed home, just in a different house. When women faced the particular crisis of violent partners, the neighborhood responded with a different kind of protection. Aunties and older women would show up, sometimes with their own husbands or brothers, and make it clear that certain behavior would not be tolerated on this block. Doors were always open for women who needed to leave quickly, no questions asked in the moment. Conversations happened later, quietly, but the immediate priority was safety. Women took each other in, hid each other, lied to men who came looking, and formed walls of protection that were hard to penetrate. Substance abuse, particularly when it started claiming lives in the 1970s, brought a crisis the neighborhood struggled to handle. Families tried to keep it private, but everyone knew. When someone's son or daughter was lost to addiction, the response was complicated. There was shame, yes, but also a stubborn refusal to abandon them completely. Mothers continued to feed their addicted children, fathers continued to let them sleep in the basement, and neighbors looked the other way when they needed to. It was not enabling so much as an inability to give up, a belief that maybe love and persistence could pull someone back from the edge. Sometimes it worked, often it did not, but the trying never stopped. Legal trouble brought its own kind of emergency. When someone was arrested, the neighborhood rallied to make bail, find a lawyer, and take care of whatever responsibilities the incarcerated person had left behind. Bail money was collected the same way funeral money was, passed quietly until there was enough. If a man was taken, his family did not face eviction or starvation because neighbors stepped in to cover his role. Lawns were mowed, cars were fixed, and sometimes someone even went to his job to explain the situation and beg them to hold the position. The system might not have cared, but the community did. Utility shutoffs were handled with creative problem-solving. Extension cords ran between houses, carrying electricity from one meter to another when the power company cut someone off. Water was carried in buckets from the house next door. People shared not because they had plenty, but because refusing to share felt like sentencing your neighbor to darkness and thirst. It was illegal, yes, but it was also survival. The rules of the outside world often did not make sense when applied to the reality of people trying to live. Evictions happened despite everyone's best efforts. When they did, the whole block would turn out to help move belongings into storage, onto porches, into garages, anywhere that would hold them until a new place could be found. Furniture sat covered with tarps in backyards, boxes stacked in attics, and no one complained about the inconvenience. The family stayed scattered across 3 or 4 households until they could get back on their feet. It took as long as it took. What we understood then, in a way that feels almost impossible to explain now, was that crises were not individual events. They were collective challenges that required collective responses. The structures that exist today, the social services and safety nets, they simply were not there for us, or if they were not designed with us in mind. We built our own systems out of necessity, out of love, and out of the knowledge that abandoning each other was not an option. Every act of help was also an investment, a recognition that the person you carried today might be the one who carried you tomorrow. There was no manual for any of this. No one taught classes on community crisis response. We learned by watching, by being raised in homes where helping was as automatic as breathing. Children grew up seeing their parents drop everything to help a neighbor, and they absorbed the lesson without it ever being spoken aloud. This is what we do. This is who we are. The systems were imperfect. Sometimes help did not come fast enough. Sometimes pride prevented people from asking until it was too late. Sometimes the community's resources were stretched so thin that there was simply nothing left to give. But even in those moments there was an attempt. There was the showing up, the acknowledgement that someone was in trouble and should not face it alone. What we lost when those neighborhoods changed was not just proximity. It was a way of living that required closeness, that demanded we pay attention to each other, that made survival a shared project rather than an individual struggle. The crises did not stop. They just became something people faced alone, or with the help of agencies that did not know their names, their stories, or their history. We carried each other because there was no one else to do it. And in the carrying, we built something that held us all.